On the morning of March 11th, 1900, 43-year-old Carrie Selvage stared out her bedroom window into the front yard of the building where she lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. The sun shined bright on her face, but it was surprisingly cold for March, and there was a chill in Carrie's room. She wore a heavy flannel blue dress and slippers, but she still shivered as she stood by the window. Carrie heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a young woman standing there. Carrie smiled, exposing her gold filling and several false teeth that she barely even noticed anymore. The young woman smiled back and then put her hand on Carrie's shoulder. To someone walking by, this might have looked like two friends enjoying the view outside the window. But that's not what was happening here. Because the building where Carrie lived was not her home. It was the Union State Hospital, a turn-of-the-century sanitarium, which today would be called a psychiatric hospital. Carrie was a patient, and the young woman standing with Carrie was a nurse, whose job was to keep an eye on Carrie basically all the time. And Carrie hated it here. Up until a year ago, Carrie had been a school teacher, saving money and building a life for herself. But over time, Carrie had become overwhelmed and sad, and she couldn't even explain why. She felt tired, but she struggled to sleep, and there were days when she just felt sort of frozen, like she couldn't leave the house. Doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with Carrie other than some problems with her vision and her teeth. So, the doctors did something that was unfortunately pretty common at this time for women. They diagnosed Carrie with hysteria and told her family to put her in an institution. That was how Carrie had lost her teaching job and her freedom and ended up living here at Union State. Now, in Carrie's room, the nurse told her that she had to go check on another patient. She told Carrie not to go anywhere until she got back. Carrie nodded and watched the nurse walk out of the room and close the door behind her. Once Carrie was alone again, she turned back to the window and looked outside. Her eyesight was terrible, so the view was not clear, but she could still make out people down below on the sidewalk walking past her. They looked like little blurs, but she watched each one for as long as she could. She felt jealous of these people, out walking by themselves. Carrie desperately wanted to go somewhere on her own, where nurses and doctors weren't hovering over her every few minutes and telling her what she could and couldn't do. She pressed her face up against the window, picturing the city she had once known so well. The streetcar rolling down its tracks, people rushing off to work, or students yelling and laughing in the schoolyard. And as she was having these thoughts, something else suddenly popped into her mind. She believed there was one particular place where, if she could just get there, she could once again experience the freedom she longed for. Just then, Carrie turned away from the window and walked over to her door. She opened the door halfway and leaned her head out, making sure nobody was in the hallway. Once she was sure the coast was clear, Carrie took a breath, lowered her head, and walked out of her room. About 5 minutes later, that same nurse came back to Carrie's room and opened the door. But now, Carrie's room was empty. The nurse walked over to the closet, opened the door, and checked inside, but Carrie wasn't in there either. The nurse wasn't alarmed. She was annoyed. Carrie had run away once before, and this nurse knew that if it happened again, she was going to have to explain why she left Carrie alone. The nurse checked the porch, where she knew Carrie liked to spend time, but it was also empty. She told herself what must have happened was a doctor came by and took Carrie somewhere. But when this nurse tracked down all the doctors on the shift, they all said the same thing. They hadn't seen Carrie all morning. Now, this nurse was starting to panic. She worried that Carrie might have tried to walk somewhere on her own and gotten completely lost because of her terrible eyesight. And so, not knowing what else to do, the nurse ran to the front desk and said she needed help right away, because Carrie Selvage had disappeared. At 6 p.m. that night, so about 8 hours after Carrie had stepped out of her room, her younger brother Joseph walked into the lobby of Union State Hospital, and it was pure chaos. Joseph saw doctors, nurses, and administrators walking as quickly as they could down one hall and into another, and everybody looked frantic. But nobody had contacted Joseph, so he did not know what was going on. He eventually flagged down a nurse and told her he was there to visit his sister, and that's when the nurse told him. His sister Carrie was missing. Joseph felt a pang of fear. He asked the nurse sharply what she meant. The nurse was clearly nervous as she explained that Carrie had wandered off. But she rushed to tell Joseph the entire staff believed that Carrie was probably still on the grounds, so there was no real need to worry. Joseph stared at the nurse with his mouth open. He was shocked. But more than that, he was mad. He had felt terrible for his big sister that she had ended up in this hospital in the first place, and he hadn't given up hope that she could maybe recover and return to the life that she had been building. He knew she was unhappy here, and now she was potentially in danger. Joseph collected himself enough to speak and said to the nurse, "Go get the police." Later that night, Detectives Chauncey Manning and Adolph Ashe of the Indianapolis Police Department arrived at Union State Hospital. Both men wore dark, well-tailored suits and hats. They were experienced investigators and had worked as partners on a range of cases. The detectives quickly met with the medical staff, who gave them a rundown of Carrie's known movements. The detectives also found Carrie's brother, Joseph, standing in a common room by the porch. He had refused to go home and was insisting that he wanted to be part of the search. Because no one had actually seen Carrie leave, the detectives decided the first priority was to search the hospital itself, even though staff had already looked. So, with Joseph and several other hospital employees following them, Detectives Manning and Ashe checked every patient's room one by one, including the closets. Then, after they did not find Carrie, they walked through the common areas and offices, bending down to search behind every piece of furniture. And when that didn't work, lastly they searched the stairways and took oil lamps up to the attic. But again, there was no sign of Carrie. Finally, Detective Manning told Joseph that they couldn't do much more tonight, but he promised that they would resume and expand their search for his sister first thing in the morning. What they didn't tell Joseph was that if Carrie had truly wandered off the hospital grounds and out into the city, then she was in very serious danger. Like other major cities, Indianapolis had its share of crime. Pickpockets and thieves were common, and violence against women was a growing problem. Carrie would be an easy target. But beyond that, at this particular moment, the city was also dealing with a truly bizarre rash of crimes. A gang of grave robbers were digging up bodies and then selling them on the black market to hospitals and universities that use the bodies for medical research. And in some cases, if a fresh body was required, these gangs would take things into their own hands and actually commit murder in order to provide that body. On the morning of March 12th, so still less than 24 hours after Carrie had gone missing, Detectives Manning and Ashe, along with a group of uniformed police officers, began canvassing the surrounding neighborhood outside of the hospital, hoping they weren't already too late. And pretty quickly, they began finding witnesses. A young boy who'd been outside at the time when Carrie had disappeared said he did see a woman in a blue dress, just like the one Carrie was wearing, running down the street right across from the hospital. And a woman who lived nearby said she'd also seen the woman wandering down the street a couple blocks away. Now, this information didn't make it any clearer where Carrie was right now, but it at least gave the detectives some hope that they were finally on her trail. So the detectives wanted to get Carrie's image in front of as many people as possible. But back in 1900, reproducing photographs was not nearly as fast or easy a process as it is today. However, photography had recently become more affordable for people, and newspapers regularly ran photos along with their articles. So the detectives met with Carrie's brother, Joseph, and got photos of Carrie that they could reproduce as cards to show people around the city. They would also put these photos in the local papers. In the week following Carrie's disappearance, Manning, Ashe, and their team walked the city, knocked on doors, and showed Carrie's picture to everyone. But nobody else beyond those initial witnesses had seen her. 2 weeks after Carrie's disappearance, on March 25th, the detectives still had no real leads, and they were getting desperate. By now, they had searched the hospital and its grounds several times. They had crisscrossed the city, dragged small ponds, and conducted hundreds of interviews. At this point, they could only think of one other place to look: the canal that cut through town. that also was not far from the psychiatric hospital. In 1900, very few women were taught how to swim, so Manning and Ash thought Carrie might have wandered near the canal, and with her limited vision, and potentially with her inability to swim, she could have not seen the water, fallen in, and drowned. So, the detectives had city workers drain the entire canal. And then after it was drained, they led a group of volunteers through the mud looking for Carrie's body. But after hours and hours of searching, they hadn't found any sign of her. As more weeks passed with no new leads or evidence, the search began to lose momentum. Carrie's brother, Joseph, had started his own campaign, going to different newspapers and asking them to keep putting photos of Carrie front and center. Through his efforts, thousands of people had seen Carrie's photograph, which was a shocking level of publicity for the year 1900. Carrie's face was by now well known across the city. But despite all this, by April of 1900, so about a month after Carrie's disappearance, the newspapers and detectives moved on, and Carrie's case went cold. Joseph and his family never stopped believing that Carrie was out there somewhere, and so every so often, over the next several months, they would put an article in the paper with a message to Carrie in it, promising that if she came out of hiding, she wouldn't have to go back to the hospital. She could come home instead. But Carrie never did. Fast forward 2 years to a day in September of 1902 inside of an operating theater at a hospital right near the one Carrie had disappeared from. A medical student wove through the crowd to a front row seat in the theater, which gave him a clear view of the operating room right below. The student felt his heart speed up, because in the center of the operating room, he saw a table covered with a bright white sheet, and he knew that underneath that sheet, there was a dead body. He and his fellow medical students had come to the operating theater today to watch a skilled surgeon dissect a real human corpse. This demonstration was, at the time, one of the only ways that doctors in training could gain a better understanding of human anatomy. And it was considered a huge privilege for them to get to witness something like this. The sound of footsteps echoed from below, and immediately the audience fell silent. The student saw the surgeon approach the operating table, and he listened closely as the surgeon explained what they could all expect to see during this demonstration. Then the student watched as the surgeon stepped up to the operating table and removed the white sheet, revealing the pale face of the corpse underneath, with a gold tooth glinting from its open mouth. The student had expected to feel amazement when he saw the body, but instead, he felt an unsettling wave of déjà vu. Something about the corpse's face looked familiar to him, but he just couldn't place it. Then, suddenly, it just came to him, and he yelled it out without even meaning to. "It's the missing woman!" he shouted. Some of his classmates laughed uncomfortably, thinking maybe he was making a very bad joke. But the surgeon called for quiet and asked the student what he was talking about. The student stood up and said he would recognize that face anywhere. The woman on the table was Carrie Selvage, the same Carrie Selvage who had disappeared from the psychiatric hospital a couple years ago. Her photograph had been plastered all over the city. Suddenly, all the other students in the operating theater all began talking at once as they leaned forward to get a better look. They all remembered the missing woman, whose brother had given what felt like 50 interviews. And they agreed the corpse on the table looked just like Carrie, down to the gold tooth. Eventually, the surgeon called out to the students to quiet down and clear out of the operating theater. The surgeon had no idea if the med student was right, but he was not about to continue with this demonstration until he checked. A few hours later, Detectives Manning and Ash stood in the operating theater with the surgeon, Carrie's brother Joseph, and Carrie's dentist. All the men stared at the body on the table, and they all had the same reaction. It could be Carrie, but they weren't sure. The medical school had not kept great records on when it actually acquired these bodies. This particular one was slightly decomposed and had been frozen for a long time. The dentist eventually spoke up and said the gold filling was the same kind he'd used for Carrie, and it was in the exact same spot in her mouth. At this, Detectives Manning and Ash walked away from the table and huddled together in a corner to whisper to each other, occasionally taking a look back to make sure nobody, especially not Joseph, was listening. They did this because what they were discussing was incredibly upsetting. Manning and Ash knew that medical schools and hospitals had a hard time acquiring dead bodies for research through legal means, so these institutions often turned to the black market and grave robbers for their supply. In fact, during the initial investigation, they had worried that Carrie might have been the victim of grave robbers, who were known to occasionally commit murder in order to increase their supply of dead bodies. Now, the detectives knew they were going to have to step into this dark, bizarre world of grave robbers to get answers. And there was one man in particular they were going to have to talk to. His name was Rufus Cantrell, but the media and the police called him the King of Ghouls. Rufus Cantrell was actually already in jail, so it was easy for Manning and Ash to find him. In just a few hours after they had stood over the corpse in the operating theater, they walked into an office in the jail and sat down at a table across from the man they thought could break their case open for them. Now, Rufus had a reputation for being violent and sort of unhinged, so the detectives were surprised that he was in a very relaxed, almost jovial mood when they met him. He told Manning and Ash that he would help them in any way he could. Manning was suspicious of this level of cooperation, but he still told Rufus all about the dead woman in the operating theater, doing his best to describe the woman's appearance and her teeth. Rufus nodded along as Manning spoke, and then when Manning was done, Rufus said he knew exactly who the detective was talking about. That was the woman who'd gone missing from the psychiatric hospital over 2 years ago. Manning looked at Rufus skeptically and asked how he could be so sure. And then he watched as a wide, unsettling smile spread across the King of Ghouls' face. Rufus said he was sure because members of the grave robbing gang he was a part of had murdered her. At this, Manning and Ash just stood there, staring in shock at the grave robber in front of them. The detectives had come here expecting a very confrontational interview, not an immediate and creepily cheerful confession. They actually didn't even know what to say. So, after a moment of silence, Rufus just kept on talking. He said he personally had not had anything to do with the murder. All he knew was that his band of grave robbers had spotted a woman in a blue dress wandering along a country road and decided she was an easy target. And they had been right. They had attacked her and then dragged her to a house they worked out of in the city, and once they got there, they clubbed her to death, and then put out the word in their network that they had a fresh body for sale. Rufus said that was when he had found out about this, around the time they were actually trying to sell the body. He said that all he had done was actually help arrange the sale of Carrie Selvidge's body to the hospital. And then after her body had been sold, it would sit frozen for 2 full years until finally, today, it had been scheduled for dissection. Detectives Manning and Ash left the jail feeling a bit blindsided. They knew there were countless reasons not to trust Rufus. He was already in jail, for one thing, and probably thought that talking to detectives, especially about a case they were really interested in, might get him out. And then there was the fact that this guy, Rufus, had literally sold dead bodies on the black market, and he was possibly a total psychopath. But the murder scenario Rufus had outlined was something the detectives themselves had considered. And in the weeks following that interview, the detectives actually had Rufus lead them, along with Carrie's brother Joseph, to the house where Rufus claimed the murder took place. And there they would find a club, as well as pieces of women's clothing. So, although Manning and Ash still remained skeptical of Rufus's story, the King of Ghouls had given them just enough evidence to finally close the case. Carrie Selvidge was officially declared dead. But there was just one problem, and that was that Carrie's brother, Joseph, absolutely refused to believe it. Now, Joseph didn't have a good alternate theory about what happened to his sister, but the grave robber story made no sense to him. Carrie had bad eyesight and she was generally nervous and unhappy, but she wasn't stupid. She had grown up in the city and knew not to wander alone at night down country roads. Plus, he knew Rufus had gotten a lighter sentence in return for his story and cooperation. So how true could it really be? And also, part of Joseph just wanted to believe that his sister had escaped the hospital and found the freedom she so desperately wanted and was now off living happily and choosing not to let anyone find her. And Joseph would hold on to this belief for a long time, until... on April 26, 1920, so over 20 years after Carrie's disappearance. On that day, Joseph got an urgent and confusing telephone call from the police at his home. An officer said he'd heard from a construction company that was working on a building in town. It was an orphanage that they were converting to an automobile repair shop, and this construction crew had found something that Joseph just needed to see. Joseph ended the call and headed straight to the building, having no idea what he was about to find. Once outside the orphanage, Joseph walked past several construction workers and then stepped inside the building. Right away, he heard somebody call his name, and he looked over to see a man with thinning white hair walking towards him. Joseph squinted, looked at the man's face, and then suddenly he recognized him. It was Detective Manning. Now, Joseph felt a jolt of adrenaline. Whatever this was, it had to be about his sister. Joseph asked Manning if Detective Ash was here too, but Manning just shook his head and said no, Ash had passed away a few years earlier. Before the two men could really talk, they were joined by a member of the construction crew, who handed them each a flashlight and gestured for them to follow him. As Joseph walked through the building, he could see that the construction crew had already made a lot of progress, but it still looked like parts of the building hadn't changed in decades. And it was one of these old, untouched areas of the building where this crew member led Joseph and Manning. And when they got there, the crew member pointed to an old stairwell set against a wall, signaling for Joseph to climb up the stairs. Joseph hesitated, but only for a second. Then he took a deep breath and slowly walked up the steps. When he reached the top, he found himself standing in a dark, narrow hallway with a low ceiling that made him feel totally claustrophobic. Joseph bent down, but it still felt like the ceiling was pressing in on him. And as he walked down this hallway, shining his flashlight from side to side, it almost looked like the walls were closing in. Joseph felt his chest tightening. This place was cramped and pitch black, and even though he knew it was ridiculous, he had this feeling like he could get stuck here. But finally, his light caught something at the end of the hallway. It was a small door built into the wall ahead of him, and it looked just big enough for him to fit through. Joseph reached the end of the hall and caught his breath. Then he opened the door and squeezed through. He stumbled forward and found himself inside of a cold, damp room that was only about 4 feet by 6 feet. But unlike the hallway, it wasn't dark and stuffy. Instead, sunlight flooded this room through 2 windows. It was bright and the air was fresh. Joseph flipped off his flashlight and began turning in a slow circle, surveying the room. And halfway through the circle, he froze. At this moment, Joseph knew he had been right for decades. That grave robber, the king of ghouls, Rufus Cantrell, had lied. The body on that table in the operating theater had not been his sister's. Because leaning against the wall inside of the small room, Joseph saw the skeletal remains of a woman, with tattered pieces of a blue flannel dress clinging to her bones and 2 old slippers lying at her feet. Joseph turned away from the skeleton towards the window. Through it, he could see almost the entire city, and Joseph started crying. Because now he understood that as much as he'd wanted to believe it, his sister Carrie had never escaped and found her freedom. Because it would turn out that the orphanage that Joseph had come to, where he climbed the old stairwell and found his sister's body, had once been the Union State Hospital, the psychiatric institution where Carrie had been committed. The hospital had shut down not long after Carrie disappeared, and the building had been used for several different things in the years that followed. And now, the construction crew that was converting it into an automobile repair shop had discovered this old staircase by accident. And that staircase led to a tiny hidden room that was located up above the attic, and that had windows to the outside. Joseph and the detectives had searched the hospital attic on the day Carrie went missing, but they hadn't noticed the staircase. So they didn't know that Carrie had actually been right there, just above them, the whole time. The official report on Carrie's death would later conclude that her terrible eyesight had led her to become lost and wind up in this room and not know how to get out again, and then she froze to death. But, as always, Joseph did not accept the official statement. In fact, he would spend years coming up with theories of his own. But there was one theory that couldn't be ignored, and that was that maybe Carrie didn't get confused and stuck inside the room because she couldn't see. Maybe, when she crawled into that secret room, she had known exactly what she was doing. Because Carrie had almost certainly been alive throughout the entire search of the hospital. Staff, police, and her own brother had been just feet away. But she never once called out or made any noise. So maybe Carrie had just decided to sit there quietly, looking out the window and across the city where she'd once been free. And when night fell and she felt that bitter cold coming on, she chose to stay in that room. The only place she knew where she could be on her own and where nobody would tell her what she could and couldn't do. On April 30th, 1920, 4 days after the discovery of her remains, Carrie Selvage was buried next to her mother and finally laid to rest. As for the two witnesses who said they had seen Carrie basically right after she had gone missing, running down the street, had simply been mistaken. And the dead woman who had been on the operating table at the West Side Medical Clinic was never identified. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. On Sunday, September 18th, 1994, Jennifer Thompson went to the county fair for the fourth day in a row. Growing up in the tiny town of Orofino, Idaho, not much usually happened. So 14-year-old Jen wasn't about to waste the most exciting days of the year. Back on Thursday, Jen and her friends had gone on all the rides from the carousel to the Ferris wheel, and then on Friday they went to the county livestock auction, and Saturday was the parade, and now on Sunday they had already watched the log cutting competition, and as they had, they totally gorged themselves on every kind of food the fair had to offer: corn dogs, funnel cakes, cotton candy, caramel apples, and also all the soda they could drink. Now it was time to go home, and Jen was feeling completely full, like she had just eaten an entire Thanksgiving dinner. Still though, she and her friends each bought one more corn dog for the road before taking one last walk around the fairgrounds and saying their goodbyes. When Jen got home, her dad Dennis was on the phone and her mom Sherry was busy making dinner. So Jen just went upstairs to her bedroom. She had a bunch of homework she needed to finish before school on Monday. Jen likes school sports a lot more than school work, but she was in 8th grade now, and she didn't want to fall behind. So she grabbed her math assignments out of her backpack and worked on equations until her mom called her for dinner. Jen made her way downstairs and sat down at the dining room table. Her mom had made one of Jen's favorite meals, chicken and rice casserole. But after all that junk food at the county fair, Jen really didn't have an appetite, so she mostly picked at her plate and told her parents all about her day at the fair, and about how sad she was that it was now over. After dinner, Jen's mom asked Jen if she wanted any dessert, and despite her very full belly, Jen said yes. And so before long, Jen was crushing a big bowl of vanilla ice cream, and then afterwards, she helped her parents clean up before she went back upstairs to her bedroom. Once there, she finished her homework, and then just went to bed early. She wanted to be well rested for school the next day. When Jen's alarm went off in the morning, she dragged herself out of bed and shuffled into the bathroom. But when she turned on the light, a sudden sharp pain shot through her stomach. She doubled over and grabbed the bathroom counter to keep from falling down. For a second, Jen felt like she was about to throw up, but she breathed through the pain, and slowly, the cramp sort of went away. Jen released her grip on the counter and straightened up again. She stood for a moment, afraid the pain might come back, but everything seemed okay. Jen told herself that most likely she had just eaten too much at the fair and she was still feeling it today, and so she just went back to getting ready for school. After brushing her teeth, Jen got dressed and slid the math homework from last night into her backpack. Then she zipped up the bag, slung it over one shoulder, and started going downstairs. But about halfway down the steps, another sharp shooting pain cut through Jen's abdomen, and this did not feel like any sort of normal bellyache she had ever had. It felt more like something was trying to tear its way out of her stomach. Jen dropped her backpack and kind of hunched forward, clutching at her stomach. The next thing Jen knew, her mom was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and concern on her face. Jen barely had time to tell her mom that she was in pain and feeling sick, before suddenly a big wave of nausea hit her, and she had to run back upstairs to the bathroom, where she vomited and also had diarrhea. A few moments later, Jen's mom, who had gone upstairs as well, knocked softly on the bathroom door and asked Jen if she was okay. Jen called out no and said she felt absolutely horrible. She said something was definitely wrong with her stomach. Through the door, Jen's mother suggested that Jen stay home from school that day. Jen was relieved, but was too nauseous to reply. When Jen's father, Dennis, got home from working at a local car dealership that evening, he went straight upstairs to check on his daughter. Sherry had told him that Jen was having a lot of stomach pain, and both parents agreed that the 4 days of crushing sugar and fried foods at the county fair was very likely responsible for this pain. But when Dennis walked into Jen's bedroom, he was shocked by how miserable she looked. Her face was red and her hair was damp with sweat. Jen told him she'd been throwing up and having diarrhea all day. Her stomach ached when she was lying down, but it hurt even worse when she was standing up. And some of the cramps were so intense, Jen said they made her cry. Dennis brushed a strand of hair out of his daughter's face, then said he was going to get her a glass of water. When he went downstairs, Sherry was waiting in the kitchen, and she would tell him that the only thing Jen had been able to stomach all day was just a few bites of ice cream, and she had been running a low-grade fever for hours. Both parents were very concerned now, but they weren't quite sure what to do. They knew their daughter absolutely hated going to the doctor, and so they agreed that, maybe now was not quite the time to take her yet. For now, Dennis and Sherry decided they would just continue giving their daughter water and Tylenol and check on her throughout the evening. Eventually, despite all her discomfort, Jen would fall asleep, and after she did, Dennis went to bed hopeful that his daughter would feel better soon. 2 days later, on Wednesday morning, Dennis got out of bed and walked upstairs to his daughter's room. But when he went inside, Jen barely stirred. She'd hardly eaten anything for 2 days, but still her stomach cramps had only gotten more painful and more frequent, and she was still running a fever, she was still vomiting, and she was still having diarrhea. Dennis knelt next to his daughter's bed and shook her shoulder until she slowly blinked awake. Then he told his daughter he had bad news. She clearly was not improving, so he and her mother had decided it was time now to go to the doctor. Jen groaned, but she didn't put up a fight, and to Dennis, this was actually a bad sign. His daughter was clearly so sick that she wasn't even trying to avoid the doctor. Dennis helped Jen get out of her bed and let her hold onto his arm for stability as they made their way down the stairs and out to the car. Then Dennis backed out of the driveway and headed to their usual family medicine clinic. A few minutes later, Dennis helped Jen climb onto an exam table, and he could tell she was struggling just to sit upright. Before long, Jen's longtime pediatrician, Lyndon Bishop, came into the room, and he was surprised to see his athletic, young patient looking so ill. He listened closely as Dennis explained his daughter's symptoms, and all the while, Jen just silently sat there, clutching her stomach and leaning forward. Dennis told Dr. Bishop that he was pretty sure his daughter had food poisoning from something she must have eaten at the county fair. But when the doctor gave Jen a quick physical examination, he said that he thought Dennis was actually wrong, that this was something else. Because he said, food poisoning usually only lasts for 1 to 2 days, and Jen had been in pain for over 3 days. And so Dennis was taken aback by this, but he understood the logic. Dr. Bishop asked Jen if she had any history of stomach pain. Her father was about to answer for her, but then Jen lifted her head up and said yes in a weak voice. But that was all she could manage to say before she had to slump forward again. At this point, Dennis stepped in and he explained that not long ago, Jen had suffered from debilitating cramps in her lower abdomen for seemingly no obvious reason. Dennis and Sherry had taken their daughter to a gynecologist, who found that one of Jen's ovaries was swollen to 3 times its normal size. Fortunately, this swelling was not cancerous, and eventually Jen's cramps had just kind of gone away on their own. Dennis admitted that, when Jen first got sick after the county fair, he didn't even think about her swollen ovary because her illness was so much worse this time. He didn't think a swollen ovary could give his daughter symptoms like a fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. But Dr. Bishop said he did think it was possible. Maybe Jen was ovulating, and that caused the swelling to return, and her symptoms came back even worse than before. It was the best and really only theory they had for now. So Jen was ultimately sent home with strict instructions to come back if the pain got any worse. Dennis was disappointed there wasn't more they could do for the moment, but he trusted Dr. Bishop's judgment, so he helped Jen off the exam table and walked her back out to the car. He leaned the passenger seat all the way back so Jen could lie down, and then as they drove home, Jen curled into the fetal position and began moaning. It made Dennis feel terrible to see his daughter suffer so badly when he really couldn't do anything to help her. But he reminded himself what Dr. Bishop had said right before they left. Don't worry, Jen will feel better soon. Later that evening, Dennis tucked his shivering daughter into bed. Sherry had gone out of town to visit the couple's other daughter. Dennis was going to be holding down the fort by himself along with Jen, and so far everything seemed to be okay. At least Jen was resting. Dennis put on his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed to watch TV, but as soon as he turned it on, he heard his daughter screaming, so he jumped out of bed and sprinted to Jen's room. When he got there, he found his daughter lying on the floor, curled up into a ball with tears streaming down her face. Jen kept screaming that she'd never felt anything that hurt this badly. She said she literally felt like she was going to die. In a total panic, Dennis ran back downstairs to the living room. He grabbed the phone and called the nearest emergency room. A receptionist answered and patched him through to a nurse, and Dennis explained what was happening, and the nurse paged Dr. Bishop, and he responded immediately, saying, "You know what? It sounds like Jen has appendicitis." The nurse told Dennis to bring his daughter to the emergency room immediately. In severe appendicitis cases, the appendix can burst open inside the body, causing complications and even death. And so if Jen had acute appendicitis, then she would need surgery to remove her appendix as soon as possible. By the time they made it to the hospital about 20 minutes later, Jen was barely coherent. Dennis lifted her out of the passenger seat and carried her into the emergency room. Under the bright fluorescent lights, he could see that his daughter's face was bright red and drenched in sweat. As soon as Dennis approached the check-in desk with his daughter in his arms, the receptionist called for the nurse who he'd spoken to on the phone. Within moments, the nurse and other members of the hospital staff loaded Jen onto a gurney, and Dennis followed as they wheeled his daughter into a nearby exam room. The nurse began taking Jen's vital signs and saw that she had a fever, she was severely dehydrated, and her pulse was distressingly high. The nurse began to explain to Dennis what his daughter's vital signs could mean, but then a short man wearing glasses and a white coat entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Maurice Mazur, and he'd already been briefed up on Jen's condition, so he went straight to her bedside and began examining her. He began to press lightly on the lower right-hand side of Jen's abdomen to check her appendix. The doctor's prodding seemed to wake Jen up, and she began to cry out in pain and tried to push the doctor away. Dr. Mazur said that it did look like Jen had appendicitis. This would explain her extreme abdominal pain, her fever, and her confusion. The doctor said the only treatment was an emergency operation to remove her appendix, like right now. But as Dr. Mazur reviewed Jen's medical charts, he told her father that something didn't look right to him. Jen's white blood cell count, her body's natural defense, was going down. The doctor said the number of those cells should be soaring right now as Jen's body fought off this appendicitis. Dr. Mazur said the drop could mean two things. Either her infection was getting better, which seemed very unlikely based on how sick Jen still appeared, or her appendicitis was getting so severe that it was overwhelming her natural defenses. And so Dr. Mazur told Dennis that bottom line, he believed Jen's appendix needed to be removed immediately. Otherwise, his daughter's life could be in danger. Dennis looked at Jen, who looked absolutely terrified. Tears filled her eyes as she said she didn't want to have surgery. But all Dennis could do was promise her that she would feel better when it was all over. And then he gave his daughter a gentle hug before the nurses took her away to be prepped for surgery. Jen's mother, Sherry, returned from visiting her other daughter just in time to find Dennis sitting in the hospital waiting room. The couple spent the next hour waiting on the edge of their seats until finally Dr. Mazur entered the waiting room and sat down beside them. Right away, the doctor said Jen's surgery had gone smoothly and she was okay. But then Dr. Mazur frowned. He explained that while Jen's appendix did show modest signs of infection, it wasn't nearly bad enough to cause the agony she had been going through. The parents were confused. Their daughter had been rushed into emergency surgery to remove her appendix, but now that that was done, it sounded like it might not have been necessary. But Dr. Mazur, who was sensing this in the parents, assured them that they'd actually done the right thing, because during the course of this operation, Dr. Mazur had discovered something very unsettling about Jen. Jen's whole intestinal tract looked red and inflamed, and Dr. Mazur didn't know why. And so, in short, because of this operation, it was discovered that Jen's appendix was not badly infected. However, the rest of her digestive system was. And so Dr. Mazur said he hoped Jen would feel better now that her appendix was out, but he just wasn't sure if that had really done anything to fix the issue. Dennis and Sherry turned to each other in amazement. Neither of them were comforted by the idea that Jen might or might not feel better. It sounded like she had a dangerous infection that the surgery hadn't really touched. But there was nothing they could do about that now, so Dennis grabbed a magazine off the waiting room table and began to read, doing his best to distract himself until he could see his daughter again. 1,200 miles away at that very moment, a different and yet eerily similar story was playing out in rural Minnesota. A young nurse named Callie Vins was working in a small local medical clinic, and it was totally packed. Normally, it was not her job to check patients in, but there were so many people crammed into the small waiting room that the receptionist needed Callie's help. Callie pushed her short dark hair out of her face, feeling totally overwhelmed. She was an experienced and highly capable nurse, but the past few days had really pushed her to her limit. Dozens of teenagers had come into the clinic with fevers, diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme stomach pains. One of the doctors who worked at this clinic thought the teenagers had the flu, but to Callie, that didn't make any sense. For starters, if this was the flu, then why were only teenagers getting sick? Why not their parents or younger siblings? And why didn't they have runny noses, coughs, or any of the other respiratory symptoms typically associated with the flu? Callie heard the bell above the front door ring as yet another nauseous teenager and their parents stepped inside. Looking around at the waiting room full of sick kids, Callie knew she needed to do something. Whatever was going on here, she did not believe their small clinic was equipped to handle it. Callie turned and told the receptionist that she'd be right back. Then Callie made her way through the crowd of people and into the back of the clinic. At the nurse's station, she pulled out the office phone book and found the number for the Minnesota Department of Health. As soon as a representative answered her call, Callie described the mysterious outbreak in her small rural town. The representative told Callie to collect saliva, urine, and stool samples from all the patients and send them in to the health department for testing. This way, state analysts could try to figure out what was causing this widespread illness. Callie thanked the official and then hung up the phone. As one of the clinic's doctors rushed past her on the way to visit yet another patient, Callie pulled them aside and explained what they needed to do. A couple days later, 14-year-old Jen Thompson was back at home in Orofino, Idaho, lying on the living room couch and watching TV. She'd been released from the hospital, but so far, recovering from her appendectomy had been very difficult. The incision on her lower abdomen was always itchy, her stomach ached constantly, and she could barely keep food down. Plus, on top of that, she'd never been so bored in her life. It had only been a little over a week since she got sick, but she already just felt so isolated. She missed going to softball practice and spending time with her friends. She even missed school, which was something she never thought she'd say. Jen picked up the TV remote and began flipping through the channels trying to find something she wanted to watch. But then suddenly this sharp, totally overwhelming pain filled her stomach, and it was so intense it made her drop the remote. The pain she was having felt just like the cramps she had had before her surgery. Jen's bottom lip started to tremble. She called out for her dad, and a second later, Dennis rushed into the room. Jen was in so much pain she could barely breathe, let alone talk. But as soon as Dennis walked into the room, she really didn't have to explain anything to him. He could see clearly how much pain his daughter was in, and so a second later he had ran out of the room, got Jen's mother, and got the car keys, and then within minutes, the entire Thompson family was back on the road, heading to the hospital. Less than an hour later, Jen was lying on a hospital bed with Dr. Mazur standing over her. Dr. Mazur pressed lightly on Jen's abdomen and said her incisions seemed to be healing fine. But clearly, something other than appendicitis was making her sick. Dr. Mazur said he was beginning to wonder if maybe Jen was suffering from an infection that was inside of her intestines. So he ordered a stool sample to be tested for a number of different bacteria. The idea of foreign bacteria inside her digestive tract really freaked Jen out, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what Dr. Mazur said next. Bacterial testing would likely take at least 24 hours to complete, and he didn't think they had any time to waste. Dr. Mazur was worried that he'd missed something along the way, so he suggested an exploratory surgery to see if he might be able to determine the source of her illness. Jen had already gone through one surgery, and the idea of being cut open again was almost too much for her to handle. She looked at her parents, wishing they could save her from this. Her mother looked like she was about to cry, while her father was just shaking his head back and forth. But Dennis told the doctor that if another surgery was what they had to do, then that's what they had to do. And deep down, even though Jen did not want to do this surgery, she knew he was right. So, despite Jen's deep anxieties, nurses began prepping her for the operation. They hooked her up to an IV and then cleaned the skin on her belly where the scalpel would cut her open. All the while, Jen felt like she was going to throw up, both from nerves and also from her illness. But just as the nurses were about to wheel Jen back into the operating room, Dr. Mazur came running into the room saying the surgery would not be necessary after all. The hospital lab was not very busy that day, so they'd been able to expedite the stool sample tests, and now he knew the source of Jen's illness. It would turn out Jen's illness was not from her enlarged ovary or from appendicitis. The doctor said she had a potentially deadly microorganism living inside her digestive tract. Now, it most likely came from something she ate, but the doctor said he had no idea what that could be. However, on the positive side, Dr. Mazur said that, while this microorganism was very dangerous, there was a very effective treatment that they could begin right away. As Jen's treatment began, 3 states away, a man named Larry Edmondson was standing in his office at the Minnesota Department of Health, staring at a large map that he'd taped up on his wall. It was a detailed picture of the state of Minnesota, and Larry had stuck a number of red thumbtacks into the map to mark different locations. Larry was leading the investigation into the mysterious disease outbreak in his state. After nurse Callie Vins had called the Minnesota Health Department, Larry and his team had received dozens of biological samples from patients at Callie's clinic. They tested each one, and they too discovered the source of the outbreak. It was the same microorganism that infected Jen in Idaho. But Larry didn't know about Jen. He thought the microorganism was only in Minnesota, and right now he was trying to figure out exactly where it came from. The Minnesota Health Department had continued receiving calls from medical clinics across the state, reporting patients with similar symptoms. Every time Larry got a call, he would send a representative to interview the sick patient and also to collect samples of anything they'd eaten recently. Then Larry put a red thumbtack on the patient's location on the map. He had hoped these red thumbtacks would be more concentrated in one particular area, allowing him to sort of pinpoint the origin of the disease outbreak. But the thumbtacks were spread out in a way that looked totally random. Larry didn't know what to make of this, but he knew that with each passing day, more people were getting sick. While Larry Edmondson puzzled over the Minnesota outbreak, representatives from the Idaho Health Department were digging through Jen Thompson's kitchen. As they did, Jen watched them from her spot on the living room couch. It had been just one day since Dr. Mazur diagnosed Jen, and she was already feeling much better. Dr. Mazur prescribed some antibiotics that were working well, and for the first time in over a week, Jen didn't feel nauseous. She could finally keep food down, but she was scared to eat anything that came from inside her house, because it might contain the deadly microorganism. Jen looked on as the employees pulled fruit, vegetables, cheeses, and meats out of the refrigerator. They took small samples of each item and sealed them inside of small labeled baggies. Jen heard them tell her parents that they would test the samples and let them know the results as soon as possible. Dennis and Sherry thanked them, and then the employees left. As soon as they were gone, Jen's dad walked into the kitchen and took all the food out of the fridge and out of the freezer and just dumped it into a trash bag, went into the backyard, and threw it away. When he came back inside, he told Jen they'd just go grocery shopping for new food tomorrow. That way they would know for sure that whatever they bought was safe to eat. At the Minnesota Health Department, Larry Edmondson had collected hundreds of food samples from the homes of people who had gotten sick. Now, microbiologists were hard at work testing those samples to determine which, if any, contained the deadly microorganism causing all the illness. Larry entered the lab to find two analysts staring down at a line of petri dishes. They looked up when they heard him come in, and he asked them for an update on their progress. And one of the analysts said that Larry's timing actually couldn't be any better, because they had just found something he needed to see. Larry immediately rushed over to them to see what they were talking about. He knew that each of these petri dishes contained a swab from the food samples that the health department had collected. The lab analysts were watching all of them for signs of this microorganism, and all of these samples currently looked normal, except for one, which had grown a whole bunch of small black circles all over the sample. Larry's eyes widened when he saw it, because those black circles were a telltale sign of this deadly microorganism. He asked the analysts which food that sample came from, and they said it was from ice cream. Larry quickly reviewed the records from his investigation, and the truth dawned on him. Every person who had fallen ill had recently eaten ice cream from a company called Schwann's. And now the health department had proof that this ice cream contained this deadly microorganism. Larry almost wanted to cheer, but he reminded himself that this was not really a time to celebrate. He was sure that the company, Schwann's, had no idea their ice cream was poisoning people, so Larry would have to call them right away. A few days later, Larry sat in his office at the Minnesota Health Department feeling very frustrated. This case just kept getting more difficult. When Larry had called the ice cream company, Schwann's, he learned something very concerning. Schwann's ice cream was not typically sold in grocery stores. Instead, it was delivered directly to customers' doors all across the United States. Now, Larry still knew nothing about 14-year-old Jen Thompson's severe illness out in Idaho, but he now understood that this disease outbreak likely went far beyond Minnesota. On the bright side, though, Schwann's had been extremely cooperative. As soon as they learned their ice cream was tainted, they shut down their factory and recalled all of the potentially contaminated products. Schwann's delivery drivers were going door to door across the nation, informing customers of this outbreak and collecting tainted ice cream. But the Minnesota Health Department still hadn't figured out how the microorganism got into the ice cream in the first place. And that was the only way to prevent this disaster from happening again. Larry read over a report from one of his colleagues. They had swabbed miles of stainless steel piping at the company's giant manufacturing plant, but none contained any trace of this microorganism that sickened all the teens. So where was it coming from? Minnesota officials had expanded their investigation to include the company's distribution system, and so Larry's coworkers were now analyzing the company's trucks, trying to see if maybe the product was contaminated during shipping. Just then, Larry's phone rang, and he picked it up, hoping it would be one of his colleagues with good news. But it wasn't. When Larry answered, he heard a man's nervous voice, and this man said he had a tip about the department's ongoing food safety investigation, but this man was calling from a payphone because he wanted to stay anonymous. When Larry heard this, he sat upright, pressing the phone hard against his ear. He told the man that was fine. Larry didn't need his name, he just needed whatever information he had. So the man whispered that he was a truck driver, and the company he worked for shipped two kinds of cargo: bulk ice cream for Schwann's and unpasteurized liquid eggs. The driver said that the same trucks could carry liquid eggs one day and ice cream the next, and then in between, The refrigerated cargo tanks on the back of the trucks were supposed to be thoroughly cleaned so that there was no contamination from one load to the next.
We walk down cobblestone streets, hand in hand our hearts beat. Laughter echoed in the air, love was everywhere. Windows fogged on rainy days, in your arms I'd lose my gaze. Whispers in the twilight glow, we never let it go. Take me back to where we danced, where love had its perfect chance. Hold those moments close and true, in that place where I found you. Stars above lit up the night, shared our dreams in moon-soft light. Even shadows felt so bright, we were each other's light. Letters written, love confessed, in that place we were our best. Promises in every sigh, together we could fly. Years may pass, hearts may roam, but that place we'll call it home. Love's sweet echoes never fade.
But, the tipster said, one driver had not been given the right cleaning supplies to disinfect their vehicle after hauling thousands of gallons of liquid eggs. So, bacteria from the unpasteurized eggs contaminated the entire truck. And so as soon as the Schwann's ice cream was loaded into that truck, the ice cream got contaminated. Larry thanked the driver for coming forward. Because of him, the Minnesota Health Department could finally close this case. Larry immediately went to his supervisors and told them the whole story. When that cargo truck wasn't cleaned properly, it turned into a giant incubator for a type of deadly bacteria found in unpasteurized eggs, called salmonella. The salmonella bacteria then mixed with a giant shipment of Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so after 14-year-old Jen Thompson got home from the county fair on Sunday, February 18th, 1994, she did her math homework, she ate her dinner, then right before bed, she ate a bowl of the contaminated Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so, of course, she and her parents had no idea that her dessert was full of salmonella bacteria. And so as a result, Jen just kept eating more and more of this contaminated ice cream each time she felt sick, because it was really the only food she could actually stomach. And so as this bacteria continued to multiply inside of her body, she got sicker and sicker. Jen and her family had no idea the ice cream was behind her illness until sometime in mid-October, when a Schwann's delivery driver came to their door and asked to take the contaminated ice cream back. The Schwann's salmonella contamination was one of the biggest mass poisonings in American history. In total, there were 593 confirmed cases of salmonella poisoning across 41 states and as many as 5,000 suspected cases nationwide. However, some experts estimate that there may have been nearly 225,000 people who got sick from this tainted ice cream. They just didn't report it. The ice cream company, Schwann's, paid out thousands of settlements to victims and changed their shipping procedure to make sure this contamination could never happen again. As for why the illness predominantly struck teenagers, it was likely due to two factors. One, young people tend to eat more ice cream, and two, young people tend to be more shy or embarrassed to talk about gastrointestinal issues than their more senior counterparts. And so as a result, maybe they began having symptoms and could have gone to the doctor and dealt with them, but in fear of being embarrassed, they didn't go to the doctor and let this condition get worse and worse and worse, and then finally it turned into a full-blown emergency room visit. But very few of the people who got salmonella poisoning had symptoms as severe as 14-year-old Jen Thompson. Even after having her appendix removed, she had to undergo at least 3 more surgeries to fix her damaged digestive system, including having her gallbladder taken out. The salmonella also caused her to develop a rare type of arthritis. To this day, Jen still lives with chronic pain, all because of a few bowls of ice cream she ate back in 1994. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Pelakonda. Fact-checking was done by